Chapter 3. Answers to Palamite Objections. Gregory Palamas notes that there are works of God, providence, foreknowledge, will, contemplation of himself, etc., which are without beginning and are uncreated, but are not the essence. They are rather energies which manifest the essence. But this does not violate his simplicity, even as the distinction between a soul and its faculties does not violate its simplicity. Palamas says that the energies are accidents of a sort, but unlike predicable accidents, they do not come and go from their subject. He seems to suggest that the energies of God are essential properties of the essence, which flow from the principles of the essence, and are therefore inseparable from it. Thus, they do not violate divine simplicity in the relevant sense. There have been a variety of defenses of claims like these. In this chapter, we will look at some of the more prominent ones. First, we will examine some of the objections of Mark of Ephesus, a writer who stood at the very end of the classical Palamite Controversy. His objections do not take much account of Thomistic theology. Modern writers who favor Gregory Palamas do so in a climate where Western theology is better known and more thoroughly studied. It is also a climate where Thomism has profoundly shaped the discourse in philosophical theology. We examine two such modern views: Eric Pearl on the superiority of a Palamite account of creation over a Thomistic one, and David Bradshaw, who argues that divine simplicity is incompatible with divine freedom. Mark of Ephesus and classical Palamite objections. As we saw in Chapter 1, although there were definitive pro-Palamite settlements in 1351 and 1368, debates about Palamism flared up off and on until almost the end of the empire. After the condemnation of Gregoras in 1351, and the translation work of Demetrios Kyronis and his circle starting in 1354, the enemies of the Palamites became more associated with the West, and particularly with the Dominicans and Thomas Aquinas, who was taken to be the chief representative of the Western theological tradition. Coming at the very end of the imperial period was the monk Mark Eugenikos, from 1392 to 1445, who eventually became the bishop of Ephesus, from 1437 to 1445, and led the anti-unionist party among the Greeks at the Council of Florence, engineering the rejection of that council in the East. Mark himself was a teacher with extensive literary gifts. He wrote many polemical works as well as theological compositions. Mark was certainly aware of the anti-Palamite arguments that came from the West, and Thomas Aquinas in particular. He seems to take a strong pro-Palamite stance, where he defends the real distinction between essence and energies with a straightforward epistemological realism, i.e., distinct concepts signify distinct realities. Though he seems to back off from this in places, admitting some sense in which the distinction is conceptual, that is, epinoia in the Greek. We have 3 edited works by Mark in which he defends the Palamite distinction. 2 of them are refutations of Manuel Kalekas's work on the essence and energy, which was Kalekas's critical commentary on the tome of 1351. The third, the syllogistic chapters against the heresies of the Academists concerning the distinction of the divine essence and energy, was published at about the same time as the 2 Antiretics, the 1430s. A translation of portions of this work is included in the appendix. The syllogistic chapters is divided into 3 sections: on the distinction between the divine essence and energies, chapters 1 through 29, on the divine light, chapters 30 through 44, and on spiritual charisms, chapters 45 through 64. We will be interested in the first section. This section seems to recapitulate many standard pro-Palamite arguments, using standard types of Byzantine arguments. For example, he tries to reduce his opponent's position to heresy or paganism in chapters 2, 4, 5, 8, and 27. Although Thomas Aquinas is mentioned once in chapter 14, and there is another acknowledgement of Latin teaching in chapter 15, there does not seem to be much engagement with or incorporation of the sort of outlook that we outlined in the last chapter. As such, many of Mark's arguments have a straightforward response from a Thomistic perspective. For example, in chapter 2, Mark argues that the identity of the essence and the energy implies that God's energy is eternal like the essence, and that creation is therefore eternal. The reply is that the energy is indeed eternal, but creatures are a product of God's intellect and will, and therefore come to be in time in accordance with these. In chapter 3, Mark gives 2 arguments. The second says that the essence and the energy cannot be generically or specifically identical, so if they are identical, they must be numerically identical. But they do not have identical concepts, therefore, they cannot be numerically identical. The Thomist would reply that one reality can indeed be referred to under two concepts, especially God, to whom all concepts derived from creatures are inadequate. In chapter 11, Mark argues that the logoi are comprehensible to us, while the essence is not, and that the logoi cannot be creatures, then they would be Platonic forms. Therefore, the logoi have to be distinct from the essence. The Thomist would reply that the logoi are not really distinct from the divine essence, as they are contemplated in God's intellegere, which is Latin for to understand. We distinguish the logoi when we recognize a creature as a participant in God. Finally, in chapter 24, Mark succinctly argues, quote, "If the very things which God is according to essence are the very things which he gives to us according to grace, then these things are not the essence of God, for he gives a share of his essence to no one." Unquote. The reply is the explanation given in the last chapter on how grace makes us a partaker of the divine nature. We participate in the essence objectively and not subjectively. Eric Pearl on the Palamite approach to creation. Perhaps the most philosophically astute defense of the Palamite distinction is due to Eric Pearl. Pearl has noticed that many of the objections to Palamis's distinction have come not from a careful reading of Palamas, but rather of his neo-Palamite defenders, such as Losky and Meindorf, who have not always described the metaphysics of Palamism correctly. Pearl focuses on Palamas himself, but limits himself to a consideration of Palamas at his most philosophically sophisticated, carefully sanitizing him of his more extreme formulations, which have found so many vociferous detractors. This is actually helpful because it helps us to get at the matters that are truly central to debate between Palamites and Thomists. For Pearl, Palamas perfected the Neoplatonic theory of participation. Earlier forms of Neoplatonism posited mean terms, the forms or participations between God, the participated, and the participants in the world. A form or participation was, as Plotinus called them, a so-called one-many. But this cannot account for the first multiplicity. Quote, "The fact is that the theory of participation simply does not allow for mean terms. On the one hand, the entire form, whole and the same, must be present to each and every participant in order to fulfill its role as a one over many. Participation can be nothing less than the possession of the whole higher reality. On the other hand, in order that it may be independent of all its participants, the form must be apart from them all." Unquote. For Pearl, Palamis's theory of the divine energies is a correction of Plotinian and Procline Neoplatonism, which is superior on purely philosophical grounds. For Palamas, the energies are God's activities with respect to creatures. Thus, they are the logoi, forms, or paradigms by which the world is made. As such, they are, or at least imply, God's real relations to creatures. But they are not so-called lower divinities, or hypostases, or intermediaries between the imparticiple essence and creatures. They are participations of God, each one being a sort of different so-called window into the divine essence, and as such, each can be, in some sense, identified with him, though he transcends them all. Not every real distinction is a distinction between rem and rem, that is, thing and thing. The divine essence and energies are related as mind and understanding. This distinction is necessary so that God's real relations to the world, which are founded on the energies, do not compromise his transcendence. This view of creation emphasizes God as formal and not efficient cause. Quote, "He causes them to be by causing them to be what they are, by giving himself to them as their whatness." Unquote. These causal powers are differentiated according to the differences of creatures. They have no separate subsistence, but exist only as cause of creatures and relative to them. Thus, they cannot be logically prior to creatures. But they cannot be posterior to creatures either, or they could not account for the creature's diversity. The only option left is to say that the energies are multiplied along with the production of creatures, though this, of course, remains eternal on the side of God. The divine energies just are God's acts of creating, multiplied along with the creature, but outside of time on the side of God. In order to understand creation properly, there must be an actual multiplicity of formal participations of the essence eternally related to created effects, which come to be and pass away in time. Quote, in short, if the plurality of ideas is to be truly possible, it must be actual. And if it is not actual, it is not even possible. Unquote. We know that there have to be logoi, or energies, or relations of this sort, because the only way we can give a fully realist account of creation is by holding the antinomy of God as imparticipable, but fully participated in by creatures. And in order to do this, we need a distinction between the essence and the energies of God as Palamism understands it. But is this really the case? In the last chapter, we saw some of the ways that Thomists try to answer the same questions. In short, Thomists try to give an account of creation as participatory in a strongly realist ontological sense as well, but without supposing some sort of plurality on the side of God. Thomists do this by emphasizing the role of efficient cause, as opposed to formal cause, in creation. But efficient causes work by bringing into being a formal likeness of the cause in the effect. Omne agens agit simi simile, after all. And this axiom needs to be understood analogically for natural and intelligent agents. God, of course, is the latter sort, who produces creatures as similitudes of himself as he knows and loves himself. Thus, there is no need for an actual plurality of logoi or energies on the side of God, because creatures are known and willed virtually transiently in God's immanent acts of knowing and loving himself. Moreover, the relation between agent and resemblance in the effect is a fully dynamic one, especially in the case of creation where there is no presupposed subject. Pearl's approach has problems of its own. In the first place, it is hard to determine just what the ontological status of this actualized plurality of logoi energies on the side of God is. If they are not mediating realities in themselves, and they are not in some sense identical with the divine essence, then what are they? Moreover, is it really intelligible to say that these energies are multiplied along with the creatures, though on the side of eternity? Can causes be multiplied in their very act of causing? Finally, and perhaps most seriously, is Pearl's account able to account for the contingency of creatures? If the logoi or energies are themselves contingent, then it seems that they have to be a product of choice that God made through his intellect and will. But then they are created. If they are multiplied by the creatures of which they are the formal participations, then it seems that just this collection of creatures is necessary. Perhaps the Thomistic solution of presenting God as an analogically intelligent agent, creating after the manner of an efficient cause, like an artisan, has something to be said for it after all. But there is one important objection to such a picture. David Bradshaw on divine simplicity and divine freedom. Is divine simplicity compatible with divine freedom? David Bradshaw points out very clearly the problem that this creates. Quote, does this not mean that if God were to will something different, then he would be something different? Since among the things that God wills is the existence of creatures, such a result would be at odds with the insistence of both Augustine and Aquinas that God's essence does not depend on his act of creation. Unquote. Bradshaw thinks that we can avoid this problem if we deny the Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity. If we instead assert a distinction between God's essence and energies ex parte Dei, that is, on the part of God, apart from our mode of conceiving and signifying, then we will have a way of explaining the divine liberty. This is because, if this distinction is made, God could remain the same in his essence, even while being different in the way that his energies are manifested in creation. However, drawing such a distinction between God's essence and energies really does not solve the problem. If the energies could have been different from what they in fact are, then there would be a reason why they are as they in fact are. Thus, there would be some contingent cause which would account for the divine energy being multiplied in creatures in this way and not in another way. But ex hypothesi, this cause could not be assigned to the divine essence. Therefore, we would be forced to suppose that there is some sort of mediate layer between the essence and the energies as these latter immediately touch creatures. But in order to maintain that this mediate layer supplies a contingent cause for the multiplication of the energies that are subsequent to it, we would have to suppose yet another layer. There would be an infinite regress. In short, the problem of the contingent plurality of creatures cannot be solved by pushing the problem back into the uncreated realm and supposing a contingent plurality there. In fact, positing an uncreated caused contingency only makes the problem more acute. Bradshaw seems to be aware of this difficulty. Therefore, he adopts a unique view of the divine energies. Basing his view on his own reading of Gregory Palamas, he claims that there are various divine energies. These various energies are apparently not only distinct ex parte re, that is on the part of the thing, from the divine essence, but also from each other. Quote, some are contingent, some are necessary. Some are temporal, some eternal. Some are realities or energies, others are activities, operations, or attributes. What could such a disparate group have in common? Simply that they are acts of self-manifestation. One way to look at Palamas is as inviting us to reconceive what we have traditionally been regarded as distinct categories, the eternal, necessary divine attributes, and contingent temporal divine activities, as species within a broader genus, unquote. Just as a person has various more or less abiding ways of manifesting his character, a gesture, a countenance, a heroic deed, a character trait, so too with God. Thus, according to Bradshaw, we can suppose that while some of God's energies are necessary and eternal complements of his essence, nevertheless others are contingent and come to be in time. But since this contingency is at the level of some of the energies and not the essence, quote, God can do otherwise without being otherwise, unquote. But again, this will still not work. In the first place, this solution proposes that there is a divine activity that is uncreated, contingent, and comes to be in time. But merely proposing that the divine energies be understood in this way is not the same as demonstrating that the proposal obtains in reality. In fact, it is not clear that there could even be something that is uncreated, contingent, and comes to be in time, for it seems that anything that is contingent and comes to be in time is a product of God's will and is caused and created. However, suppose for the sake of argument that the divine energies could be understood in this way. Then we can still make the same argument that we did above. There would have to be a reason why these energies came into being and not other ones. This determination would be either by the essence or another sort of energy. But ex hypothesi, it could not be by the essence, so it would have to be by another sort of energy. But this energy would still be contingent, so it would demand a cause, and there would be infinite regress. In sum, making a distinction ex parte re between God's essence and energies does not really solve the problem, because, as Garrigou-Lagrange and Billouart note in their formulation of the problem, the conflict does not exist between God's liberty and his simplicity, precisely as such. Rather, the conflict is more precisely between God's liberty and the immutability of his essence, which is something that all classical theists, Thomist or Palamite, would want to maintain. Therefore, we do not need to reject divine simplicity in order to explain divine liberty. In fact, for St. Thomas, we should not reject divine simplicity in favor of divine liberty, because he thinks that we have good arguments for both, despite the difficulty in reconciling them. We have already seen some of the reasons why St. Thomas defends divine simplicity. We can summarize his grounds for defending the fact that God has free choice. God must have a will because he has an intellect by which he can apprehend his proper good. This will must also have free choice with respect to anything that he wills apart from himself, because being perfectly in act is a perfect good that can be had without having anything else. Or, to put it another way, as possessing an intellectual nature, God can scrutinize and judge various possible beings. The power of free choice is radically in the intellect, because it can recognize the various ways that different possible beings are not necessary to God, so that he might attain his proper end. Therefore, not only can God will or not will things apart from himself, but he can also will this rather than that. Now all of this seems quite undeniable. Therefore it seems that we must, at least prima facie, favor the supposition that divine simplicity can be reconciled with divine liberty, rather than with the contrary supposition, even if we cannot see the reconciliation right away. After all, God is mysterious. But can we catch a glimpse of the mystery? Can we make the reconciliation clear quod nos? We can do it in 3 steps. First, we need to consider the difference between how a creature wills and how God wills. Then, we will consider how creatures come forth from God and are related to him and to his active will. Finally, we will be in a position to assert that creatures cannot be the sort of objects that specify the divine act of willing. Thus, God's act of willing would really be the same even if he had willed a different set of creatures. Once we have succeeded in showing all this, we will have succeeded in showing that divine simplicity can be reconciled with divine liberty. It is worth taking a moment to think about how a human agent wills. We naturally and spontaneously will our own end, happiness in general, but we do not immediately possess it. Thus, we must launch into a process of deliberation about the means to attain that end. These means themselves, at some point in our deliberation, will become mediate ends. These mediate ends will be objects that will specify acts by which the potency of our will may be reduced if we choose to perform them. Thus, our free choice consists of the potency to either this act or that act, which acts are specified by either this object or that. One of the key insights that we need in order to reconcile divine simplicity and divine freedom is that this is not how divine willing works. As an intelligent agent, of course, God wills his ultimate end inasmuch as he knows it. But God is goodness itself, so he is his own ultimate end, and he understands himself perfectly. Therefore, God wills his own goodness as his ultimate end, and he does so necessarily. Now, in perfectly knowing himself, God knows all the ways in which his being can be participated, and in loving himself desires that there exist beings who share in his being. Thus, God wills other beings apart from himself. Moreover, because things apart from God are participation in his being and directed to them as their ultimate end, God wills both himself and the things that are apart from him by a single act of his will. In loving his goodness, he loves all of the existing things that he knows as participating in it. Nevertheless, God can attain his end apart from the existence of things that are other than himself. Thus, their existence is not absolutely necessary. Notice what we have discovered about divine willing. God's willing differs from our willing in two ways. First, unlike our willing, God's willing does not exhibit a means-ends relationship. It is true that creatures are willed on account of God's goodness, but they are not the means by which God attains his goodness. God's goodness is the end towards which creatures are ordered, but God wills this goodness prior to them and independently from them. Second, notice that this means that the object that specifies God's act of willing is his own essence, and not the creatures which he orders to his essence. We can summarize the difference between God's act of willing and our act of willing in the following way. Our freedom comes from a potency which is indifferent to being actualized by a variety of different acts, which are specified by a variety of different objects. Our freedom depends on our passivity with respect to a variety of different objects on whose goodness our will depends. God's act of willing, on the other hand, is specified and fully actualized by his essence alone. This is the object on which his will immediately and necessarily bears, antecedently to any willing of creatures. This makes God supremely independent from the willing of any particular creature. Our act of willing depends on its object. Creatures, however, depend on God's act of willing. Freedom in God has to be understood analogically when compared to human freedom, for it, quote, is the dominating indifference not of a potency, but of a pure act of subsistent love, unquote. Now, if the adequate and specifying object of the divine will is the divine goodness, the question naturally arises, in what sense, if at all, are creatures objects of the divine will? In order to understand how the divine will regards creatures, we first need to think about how the necessary act of the divine will is related to the free act of the divine will. These are only distinct by a distinction of reasoning. That is, the free act of God is entitatively identical with his necessary act. We only mentally distinguish them when we think of God as logically related to the creature, subsequently to considering the creature and its relation to God. It is admittedly mysterious how a contingent habitude can have a necessary and immutable foundation. But to see how this can be so, we must always remember that divine freedom has a different basis from what forms the basis of human freedom. Active dominating indifference over all creatures whatever. So we must always be careful to purge our notions of human freedom from our imaginations about divine freedom. All of this is to say that creatures are not objects that specify the divine will, for God does not depend on them as objects of his will, but rather he makes them to depend on him, and subsequently, to the constitution of his will, he gives the creatures the ratio of object precisely as constituting them as participations in his being in order towards his goodness. If the primary formal object of the divine will is the divine goodness, then creatures are the secondary material objects, loved by God because they participate in his being and his goodness. But they only have a share in that goodness because he constituted them in that being and goodness, not because he needed them in order for his transcendent activity to be, but simply because, according to the hidden counsels of his wisdom, he thought it fitting. So what is the basis for the distinction of reasoning between the necessary act and the free act of God's will? It is the particular ratio under which each regards the formal, primary, specifying object of the divine will, namely the divine goodness itself. The necessary act regards divine goodness in se, while the free act regards divine goodness as it may be participated. But of course, entitatively, there is nothing really different about these two. God wills himself and creatures by a single act of will. Nor is there any necessary reason why one set of beings must be preferred to another. Here we are in the realm of fittingness. The principle bonum diffusivum sui, which I think means that good diffuses itself, must be understood analogically among non-intelligent, intelligent, and divine beings. Therefore, we make a conceptual difference between God's necessary act by which he loves himself and his free act by which he loves creatures, when we consider the latter as connoting a certain relation toward creatures. But as we have seen, this relation toward creatures is not a real relation. It only arises in our minds as a result of our consideration of the creature's relation of dependence upon God. But this means that if God had willed a different creation, God would have different relations to different creatures. But these relations are only relations of reason. This means that in different universes, our concept of God's free act would be different only by different relations of reason. In any possible universe, God's active will, whether considered as necessary or free, would be entitatively the same, because it takes its specification from God's essence. Would God's active will be any different if he had chosen to bring different things into existence? No. One final clarification remains to be made. Part of the difficulty in thinking of God's action as free stems from the eternal immutability of the act of his will. There was no time when God decided to make these creatures rather than those. His eternal and immutable act of will always was to love his goodness and to create these creatures. This does imply a kind of necessity, but not an absolute necessity. Absolutely speaking, there is no compelling reason why God would have to love his goodness in diffusing it into these creatures rather than those, or to any creatures at all. This lack of a compelling reason secures the non-necessity of any particular creature with respect to the divine act of will. However, there is another kind of necessity, that of necessity ex suppositione, or suppositional necessity. This is the kind of necessity that this creation has due to the fact that it is eternally and immutably willed by God. Supposing that God has eternally and immutably willed this creation with his one act of will, he cannot not will it. So, to sum up, God necessarily wills his own goodness as his own perfect beatitude. That is, he loves his essence as the primary, adequate, and formal object which specifies his will. Since he perfectly understands and possesses his own essence, his will has attained its ultimate end, and he has no need of other things as a means to obtain his ultimate end. His act of will is specified by this object, and there is no need for him to create any creatures. Or, if he does create, there is no need for him to create any particular kind of creature. He did this out of the fitting decree of his wisdom, deciding to love in the beings that participate in him what he loves in himself. God's necessary act of will and his free act of will are distinct only by a distinction of reasoning from his necessary act. The former considers God's goodness in se, in itself, and the latter considers his goodness as participable. We tell them apart because our concept of the latter is joined with the logical relation to what God has created. But if God had willed to create something different, our concept of God's free act of creation would only differ from what it is in this creation by a logical relation from God to creatures. Entitatively, God's active will would be the same as it is now. Even under the assumption of divine simplicity, God can do otherwise without being otherwise. And of course, divine immutability does imply a certain kind of necessity to creature, not an absolute necessity, but a necessity ex suppositione. Supposing that from all eternity God wills to create this world, then he cannot not create it. Conclusion. What can we say about the relative merits of Thomism and Palamism? From this study, it seems clear that they make claims that are philosophically incompatible. This study has argued for the superiority of the Thomistic account. Characteristic of the Thomistic approach, as we have presented it, here is the idea that our concepts are derived from creatures, and therefore we need to be careful about how we apply them to God. This is why we paid such careful attention to the Thomistic doctrine of distinction and the Thomistic doctrine of divine naming. These give us the tools to critique our terms and concepts before we apply them to God. This is not always done in Palamism, despite this school's claim to take apophaticism seriously. As we have seen, there are two places in particular in which we need to purify our conceptual language when it comes to God: in our understanding of divine simplicity, and in our understanding of how creation works. When we do this, we find that Thomism gives an account of God as an agent who diffuses his goodness into creatures according to the decrees of his wisdom and love. Moreover, it is precisely the Thomistic understanding of divine simplicity and creation which allows us to explain how God is both transcendent over and intimately present to creation, and in fact how God's transcendence and presence are mutually conditioning. One is the reason for the other. Though we have had to be critical of Palamism, it is important to understand the larger affirmations that Thomists and Palamites share: divine impassibility, divine incomprehensibility, a strong and realistic concept of deification, creation understood as a dynamic participation in the activity of God, and a commitment to mystical contemplation as the normal form of perfection in the Christian life, to name a few. Where these two schools differ is on the level of theological opinion, which come from divergent philosophical theses, which is something that need not cause Christian division. Seeing things this way allows us to tone down the polemics of the debate. The debate about Palamism has all too often been a stalking horse for other issues, and because of this, people have often resorted to crude polemics instead of careful discussion, and have told the history of the controversy in terms of simplistic binary oppositions that serve contemporary agendas. The way forward is to set all of this aside and to focus on the arguments. Doing this will give us the fascinating opportunity to explore the way that God is acting in all of our lives, so that he might share his life with us.